All right, intermediate algebra students, let's go ahead and do our last section, 5.8 for our class, for our textbook. And in this one, we're actually going to take all our understanding of the quadratics, right? So again, we have ax squared plus bx plus c. And we're actually going to find under certain conditions, quadratics can actually mathematically model some situations pretty well. We can take our ability to solve these equations and therefore solve some word problems. So what I'd like to set up for you guys right now is my way that I would love for you guys to do a word problem. As you will see later on in some videos, if you're doing a setup phase and a sub and solve phase, it's very easy for me to give you some partial credit. That way, if you don't get the whole problem right, at least you followed a process and you have some of the things right, and I can give you some points. The setup phase is the number one thing that you probably should do no matter what. Unfortunately, a lot of students choose not to do it because they're trying to solve something. But remember, to solve something means we have to have an equation, because in mathematics we solve equations. So the whole goal behind the setup is to create the equation we need so that I can do the solving that we're eventually going to do. So make sure you've got that right, all right? Because we technically don't solve word problems, we solve equations, and in all that verbiage there's an equation. So the first thing you want to do in a setup phase, this is actually broken up into two pieces, and the number one thing you want to do is you want to label your unknowns. Call them something. All right, so maybe we're talking about a right triangle that has some height to it and some base to it. Maybe we're talking about a rectangle that has some length and some width. Maybe we're dealing with a situation where there's two numbers, right? So x would be the first number and y would be the second number. All right, and so that's what I mean by labeling your unknowns. Tell yourself very clearly what the variables represent in the situation that we might be dealing with. All right, and then the reason that's important is because after you set up and label your unknowns, the next thing you need to do is you need to create the same number of equations as unknowns. That's why that first part is so important. So if we have two unknowns, like for example, let's say we have a situation where we're dealing with two numbers and we've labeled one x and one y, that means that somehow, some way, through that word problem, we've got to create two equations. Perhaps we do a problem, or there's only one unknown, right? H is the height of something, and then all we need is one equation, right, to match that one unknown. Maybe we're dealing with an area of a rectangle and the length and the width are not known. Then we're going to have to come up with a number of solutions or number of equations that match up the number of unknowns that we have. So that is probably the hardest phase, but the most important phase, because then once you've done that, you're down to the sub and solve, and that's the first thing. You're going to substitute information. Maybe it's a number, maybe it's another function, maybe it's another formula, whatever the case might be. You're going to find that as we do this, you're going to make some sort of a substitution for the problem. And then once we've made that substitution, we can solve the remaining equation. And it's not going to be any secrets. Because we're solving quadratics, hopefully somewhere, somehow, after all this setting up and substituting, we have a quadratic to solve. And of course, we've seen the way that we solve that is we multiply, right? We figure out what times what equals this trinomial degree 2, set it equal to 0, and then we basically have our zero factor property come into play. So that's going to be the step-by-step process. And like I've said, once you guys start taking a test and I start grading this, it's relatively easy for me to give you points. If I can see you labeling your unknowns, you've done it clearly, like you've called them something, or you have some sort of picture where you've labeled the sides, then that's labeling your unknowns. And if you do that correctly, I'm going to give you points. If you create the same number of equations as unknowns, then I'm going to give you some more points, right? Sometimes there's only one equation, so there's a point. Sometimes there's a couple of formulas, so there's another couple of points. If you substitute the information correctly, I can give you a point. So even though you might have the wrong equation, as long as you're trying to do the right thing in substituting, right, it makes it easier for me to give you some points. And then, of course, you get the brunt of your points by actually solving whatever you have correctly at the end. All right? So that's basically our game flow of what we want to do as solving an equation for these guys. All right? And one last thing, kind of to the setup. This happens quite frequently in your homework. All right? A little heads up. There's this idea of consecutive, I hope I spelled that right, integers, consecutive odd integers, and consecutive even integers. All right? I think our textbook really likes these types of problems a little bit. And so what they mean by that is if we have consecutive integers, we're talking about a situation like 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. So basically we're talking about our integer numbers, and they basically, it's like counting essentially. And the relation that we see here is if x is basically the first number, then x plus 1 is going to be the second. And if you want to go even one, right, x plus 2 would be the third, right? Because you'll notice again, if 5 is our first one, 6 is 5 plus 1, and 7 is 5 plus 2. So whatever the first number is, the next one in consecutive order is one more. The next one in consecutive order is two more. So kind of remember that. And then odd integers, well again, if we look at our odd integer, we got 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, and so forth. So if x is the first odd, then the next consecutive odd would be x plus 2. So if 5 is my first odd number, 7 being the second one, you'll notice that 7 is 5 plus 2. So there's a little bit of a formula for that situation, as well as even situations. If we're talking even, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, then again, if x is the first even, right, then x plus 2 would be the second even. So that's going to come up a little bit. So you can already see what I'm doing in the language of consecutive integers, odd or even. I'm back up here where I'm labeling my unknowns and starting to set up so I can do a substitution later. And this comes up quite frequently in a lot of your homework. So I thought since we're talking about setup, I thought I'd sneak that in you right now. That way we can just concentrate on doing the problems. So what you're going to see me do in the next several pages, now that we have kind of a game plan, is you're going to see me follow this game plan for all our problems. I'm going to label my unknowns, create the sum number equations, work in a substitution, solve the remaining equation that I have. All right? So let's get that to work. Let's put this in action, and I'll see you in some videos coming soon.